Our next speaker is the President of the Humanists WA, Stevie Modern. Stevie has stewarded Humanists WA for 2 years, and his team on the management committee is pleased to have his passion and energy lead us into our 50th year celebration. Stevie has had a long career in design and architecture fields in which the question of how to live are central in the context of the domestic. But the question of how to live has also been a concern of his more broadly in our evolving polity. Responding to that high call, Stevie has spent time in the political office of the WA Member of Parliament, helping that member's constituents navigate regulatory issues in government. Continuing to be motivated by that question, how are we to live? Stevie plunged again into academic effort to study journalism at Curtin University. His writing talent and skill have now become the tools of a critical and discerning eye. That discerning talent is now published in blogs, newspaper articles and journal articles in the Australian Humanist magazine. Please join with me in welcoming Stevie Modern.
Well, thank you. And can I start by saying thanks to our team at Humanists WA who bring this event together and helping make it possible. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Well, many might ask, what are the humanists' specific interests in refugees and on behalf of case? Aren't humanists more concerned about reason and faith, about the relationship between religion and society? Well, first and foremost, our motto is justice, reason and compassion. And it's become clear to us that there is a new and dangerous faith, a belief that defies all evidence and seems to mock Australia's powers for rational debate. That is the belief that refugees, particularly so-called boat people, represent a threat to our national security and to our way of life. These beliefs are myth. Faiths rely on myths. Myths are different from lies. They are stories that get told over and over, usually to represent some of our deepest fears and anxieties. But how did these myths and fears take over? Well, in order to challenge that faith, to reclaim our identity as a big-hearted and welcoming nation, we must look to facts and to history. History has shown that humans can be welcoming and compassionate, but that at times of crisis, they can act like a trigger in reviving those kind of myths that I'm talking about. I will offer examples where refugee groups arriving by boat were once welcomed as brave individuals seeking their freedom and their dignity, only later to become distrusted and feared. The first example I will use is Britain. British media reaction to Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Europe by boat. And the second is the US. America's media response to Cuban refugees by boat in the 1980s. In both, you will see parallels to Australia's own emotional fears toward refugees and the damage that recurring myths can do to a once welcoming identity. World War II is over, and Europe's refugee centres are overcrowded with survivors of German concentration camps. In the movie Exodus, a scene here, shown here, set in this time, actor Paul Newman plays a Jew who disguises himself as a British soldier. Dressed in a British uniform, he fools the commanding officer into releasing Holocaust survivors out of Britain's offshore detention camp in Cyprus, make believing they're going to be transported back to Germany. Really, he's seeking to rescue them under British noses aboard a cargo ship waiting in the harbour to take them to British Palestine. Exodus, the movie, dramatises the real-life account of post-war Jews fleeing Europe. After World War II, Britain maintained a policy of turning the boats back. It turned back boatloads of Jewish refugees, many who drowned at sea, to prevent them from reaching British territory in Palestine. The SS Exodus, seen here, was loaded with 4,500 survivors when it was rammed by the British Navy. Britain's policy was to return all ships to their origin or imprison the seekers and deport them to offshore detention centres. Here's an example here. Based on the historic novel by Leon Uris, Exodus captures that immediate post-war attitude of the British government to the so-called Jewish problem. Menachem Begin, who later became Israel's sixth Prime Minister, was at this time part of the underground movement that brought refugees into British territory. He describes British immigration policy with such eerie precision you can almost detect in his words Australia's own policy today towards asylum seekers. Begin writes, "One cannot say that those who shaped the British Middle East policy at that time did not want to save the Jews. It would be more correct to say that they very eagerly wanted the Jews not to be saved. They were highly interested in achieving the maximum reduction in the number of them liable to seek entry." And hasn't Australia's focus switched in the same way? Focused on reducing votes, on bringing down numbers, as if distance from the problem is the same as solving it. Like Britain's so-called Jewish problem, these comforting solutions, myths, do not focus on war and persecution as root causes, but persuade us to believe that its victims are instead to be blamed as perpetrators. Asylum seekers have largely disappeared from our national headlines, partly because their views are so rarely quoted. But through the lens of history, we can see the same story techniques, the same characterisations and myths that lead us to humanitarian crisis. Well, how did British media at the time mislead the reading public to fear the impact of boat people? In a 2003 study of articles from The Times, Manchester Guardian and Jewish Chronicle, Paul Burgon found that 1930s and 40s articles in Britain remained rife with anti-Semitism. Any support for refugees seeking safety only fed popular prejudices of Jews in Britain, the myth that they were somehow two-faced or had divided loyalties. Like Australia's signing of the Refugee Convention, Britain had actually made a carefully worded proclamation promising that the Jews could settle in what was then British territory. In the 1917 Balfour Declaration, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour pledged that His Majesty's government views with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Britain's earlier esteem and respect for the Jewish Chronicle at that time was that it allowed this publication to publish the declaration before any of its rival news media. But as the years went on and the tensions rose and the numbers fleeing Hitler's Germany began to increase, Britain became alarmed and tried to ban Jewish refugee immigration. Lord Moyne, who became Britain's Minister Resident in the Middle East, made a 1942 speech in the House of Lords. He railed against Britain's earlier promise, speaking of the racial purity of other races over what he called Jews' mixed identity and, in that, their loyalty. Their arrival by boat from Europe was met with that suspicion and fear for their divided loyalties. And as news of the Nazi horror began to filter back to the Jewish community in Britain, Britain's blockade against the refugees, resulting in ships laden with desperate survivors being turned away and even sunk, it led to increasing levels of frustration and opposition. The newspaper The Times echoed the government's sentiment. Despite a context of starvation and illness of those still left in the refugee detention camps, its own reporting framed illegal boat arrivals as a security threat. The Sunday Times even singled British Jews out along with the refugees. In an article headlined, "To British Jews," it accused them of failing to properly denounce those defying the British blockade, not performing their civic duty and their moral obligation. Which begs the question, here they are being singled out by their race, and yet they were accused of not behaving sufficiently British. The Manchester Guardian demonstrated how widespread this media response to the boats actually was. It described the way the media conflated humanitarian questions with border security. The British government seems happily convinced that what it's doing in Palestine is right. If Jewish refugees from Europe have to be shipped off to Cyprus, it's unfortunate. But since they had no business to go to Palestine in the first place, it is not the fault of the British government. If some of them in their desperation jump into the sea and try to swim ashore, they must be hauled out again. And you can read the rest for yourself. What the media failed to do was to report the context in which those boat arrivals tried to reach the safety of British territory. Australian media reportage of asylum seekers, like those jumping overboard, similarly missed this context. American reporting of Cuban refugees by boat also forgot this context for a time. Myths of criminality are commonplace. The feature that links all these three histories are a collective description of the individuals. Collective terms like boats, floods, waves, numbers of immigrants, these act to overwhelm the reader with a sense of their irresistible and powerful force, an unreasoning sense of their danger. A failure to interview, quote, and represent the voices within that influx strips away our possibility for empathy towards the victims seeking sanctuary. Now, America began the 80s with a very positive attitude toward refugees. President Carter comfortably represented US feeling by proclaiming America's welcome with, quote, our open hearts and our open arms. Well, imagine that. But from 1980, America's positive attitude to this exodus, refugees fleeing Cuba, changed abruptly to one of hostility. The New York Times article credited with sparking this reaction was Ed Schumacher's front-page story, "Retarded people and criminals are included in Cuban exodus." The article referred to the Mariel boat lift. It took its name from the Berlin airlift. It was about nearly 37,000 Cubans who had escaped in a breakout from the port of Mariel, Cuba. 125,000 Cuban refugees reached American shores that year, and those numbers really put things into perspective, as Terry was pointing out earlier. But during a brief pause in Castro's blockade, many Americans had even sent out boats to collect asylum seekers themselves. Schumacher's front-page article reversed much of that. It reversed America's welcoming attitude. It focused on 200 so-called criminals amongst those 37,000 arrivals. There was no attempt to cover the context as to how those prisoners had managed to get onto boats. In truth, they had been forced there. Those seeking freedom were all tainted as collectively by this criminality. Decades later, this was acknowledged as Castro's aim to discredit those that had fled Cuba. But with all of these asylum seekers now made illegal, Schumacher's story left aside people's circumstances, switching it more to boats, to the numbers. The subheadline, as you can see, reads, "The Cubans include unwanted elements." There's an intro description of a man whose ribcage protruded from his chest and whose few teeth remained, his eyes bulged with fear on his way to live in the United States. If the man was starved or mistreated, the reader was left only to guess. There is no explanation. Only the undesirable, ghoulish descriptions of one, somehow representing tens of thousands, were on their way. Then there's the collective words. In just this one article, Schumacher manages to fit in the words criminals, common criminals, Cubans, scum, misfits, unwanted elements, failures, human cargo, delinquents, and an exodus. One word is not used, people, except when he refers to those who live in the United States. No mention is made of the innocent, the healthy majority, or the political escape of the asylum seekers. With a fear of criminals and the unwanted that this story describes, the asylum seekers were sent to temporary detention centres. One state governor, facing election in Arkansas, lost his state election for accepting his state's share of the unwanted elements. He was not a politician who made any hard, unpopular decisions twice. He would not forget. Later, as US President, Bill Clinton began a new policy toward Cuban asylum seekers. He would institute a policy of turning the votes back. As I said, we can learn from history. It's now too easy to see the enormous contributions these once refugee people have made. Cuban Americans, Refugees, like Medal of Freedom winner Arturo Seligman. Refugees, like Grammy Award winner singer-songwriter Gloria Estefan. Or so-called boat people, like Mirta Agito, who fled Cuba and became a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author. They are a thriving part of their communities. They are part of Miami's incredible cosmopolitan, multicultural heart. They are the brute facts which dispel the myths like those of Ed Schumacher. But Australia has its share of journalists like Ed Schumacher. Foreign Affairs editor Greg Sheridan writes in The Australian that the Refugee Convention is acting as a magnet to attract people here, and we're spending billions on the problem which we could spend on real refugees. The focus is again not on the context of those seeking asylum, but on their appearance. In one article, Sheridan makes the reader importantly aware that others on the boat included African women dressed with headscarves, parents holding babies. Now, why was this visual evidence so important? Well, a few days earlier, he had written, "This boat people phenomenon is essentially determined Muslim immigration. It's important to confront the sensitivities of this situation head on. The overwhelming majority of Muslims in Australia are law-abiding, productive citizens." Well, how does he confront this sensitively? He collectively describes asylum seekers as, quote, "this huge unregulated Islamic inflow." Sheridan ignores the very political and cultural aspects of those that are being faced in predominantly Muslim countries, many confronting other insensitivities, not just Sheridan's words, but things like dictatorship and war. Note that he makes explicit this is illegal immigration. He also implies it, since, to quote Sheridan, the majority in Australia are law-abiding and productive citizens. Again, like Ed Schumacher's article, they are not people. In his words, they are a phenomenon, a word perfectly describing an inflow, a thing, an event of no knowable context. Now, you would expect a foreign affairs editor to be sensitive about geography, like distances, but his proof that illegal immigrants have been lured to Australia by our generous policies lay in the fact that, quote, "no boat numbers of any consequence came from the Middle East to Japan or South Korea." I think we're going to go and get into that. But then there's the warlike language, which began even before the government made refugees by boat a military operation. In an article entitled "Smugglers Exploit Policy Chaos to Target the Mainland," Paul Stewart writes that another boat evaded Australia's border defences. The boat in question targeting us was a fishing vessel carrying 11 people. Australia refuses all asylum seekers arriving by boat entry into Australia. And at this crucial turning point, this crisis, we must learn from the errors of the past, of Britain's shameful mistreatment and imprisonment of Holocaust survivors, or the many Cubans turned away in dangerous waters by the US just 90 miles from shore. Must we wait until future generations learn from our policies and our characterisations toward boat people trying to reach safety? Let's learn more from former refugees. Talk to them, find out where, how and why they came. Listen to the individuals who sought sanctuary from war, bloodshed and persecution. As different as each of them are, none are part of an anonymous inflow. Is there anything more personal than risking and saving one's own life? Let's ask why they tried so hard to reach our borders if they really meant to change them. Could it be that they love and respect what those borders represent, all the freedoms that we enjoy within it? Why are the people tossed on dangerous seas so hopeful? And why to those of us who only lived on firm soil, why is it that we are the ones that look so afraid? Is that justice? Is that compassion? Is that reason? Thank you.